Leila Thompson, a successful black billionaire in her early 40s, is the CEO of a leading tech company that has revolutionized the industry with its innovative products and services. Known for her sharp business acumen and a deep commitment to charitable causes, Leila has built an empire from the ground up. Her philanthropic efforts have made a lasting impact, improving the lives of underprivileged communities worldwide. However, despite her immense wealth and influence, Leila remains grounded and humble. She avoids the spotlight, believing that true power lies not in wealth or fame, but in how one treats others. Her understated appearance reflects this philosophy. Leila often dresses simply and elegantly, choosing comfort over extravagance. After an exhausting day filled with meetings and important decisions, Leila boards a first-class flight, looking forward to a rare moment of peace. The soft hum of the plane offers the perfect escape from her high-pressure career. She enters the cabin quietly, not seeking attention but simply yearning for a few hours of solitude. Leila's simple attire, a tailored black coat and slacks, matches her unassuming nature, and as she settles into her seat by the window, she feels a deep sense of relief. With the gentle comfort of the plush seat surrounding her, she prepares to unwind, eager to reflect on the recent success of a charitable project she had completed. This flight, she hopes, will provide the mental space she needs to recharge before facing the next chapter of her demanding life. As Leila settled into her seat, the soft hum of the airplane and the warmth of the first-class cabin provided her with a sense of relief after the stress of her day. She gazed out the window, feeling the tension of her busy life begin to slip away. But her brief moment of peace was soon interrupted by Eliza, a flight attendant in her late 20s, who had been silently observing the cabin. Eliza had worked in the airline industry for several years and prided herself on providing impeccable service to the first-class passengers. However, when her eyes landed on Leila, something shifted. At first, her face was warm, professional, and courteous, as it always was with first-class passengers. But as she took in Leila's modest attire, a simple black coat, plain slacks, and a small leather handbag, Eliza's expression immediately darkened. In her mind, there was no way someone who looked like Leila, dressed so simply, without the usual designer accessories or flashy clothing that she associated with first-class travelers, could possibly belong in such a premium seat. The thoughts were fleeting, but they quickly settled into her consciousness. Eliza glanced down at the seating chart and noticed Leila's name. There it was, in clear print. Leila Thompson, the very same name as a high-profile CEO known in the business world. But there was something about the woman in front of her that didn't quite fit her preconceived notion of someone in first class. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to be professional, but her instincts told her something was off. Without any warning, Eliza walked toward Leila. The smile she had been wearing when greeting other passengers seemed to have vanished, replaced by an almost imperceptible scowl as she approached Leila's row. Her tone was formal, but there was an edge of suspicion that immediately put Leila on guard. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you're in the wrong cabin," Eliza said, her voice cool and detached. "Your seat should be back in economy." Leila, still wrapped in the peacefulness of her thoughts, looked up, momentarily surprised. Her calm eyes met Eliza's, and she could see the subtle judgment behind the flight attendant's words. The woman's posture was stiff, her expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the suspicion. Leila took a slow, deliberate breath, sensing where this was headed. "No," she replied softly, her voice unwavering. "I'm in the right seat. This is my assigned seat." Despite Leila's calm response, Eliza's expression didn't change. Instead of offering an apology for the mistake, Eliza took a step closer and continued to scrutinize Leila, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone now laced with doubt. "I don't think you belong here. This seat is for first-class passengers, and it's rare that someone who looks like you would be sitting here." Leila's eyes flashed with a subtle hint of surprise, but she quickly masked it with calm composure. She had dealt with these kinds of assumptions before, though this one felt different, more overt, more targeted. She reached into her handbag, producing her boarding pass, and handed it to Eliza without a word. Eliza didn't take the ticket immediately, but instead stood there for a moment, inspecting it as if she were searching for an error. She flipped the ticket over, scanning every inch of it. A moment of silence passed, and the tension in the cabin began to grow. The other passengers, sensing something was off, started to glance toward the confrontation. But no one said anything. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and others stared at the exchange with curiosity. Leila remained seated, her back straight, her gaze unwavering, even as Eliza continued to inspect the ticket far longer than necessary. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eliza returned the ticket to Leila, her hands stiff, her eyes still wary. "Well, I suppose the ticket is valid," she muttered, though the doubt in her voice was unmistakable. "But I still don't think this seat suits you." Her words were cloaked in thinly veiled disdain. It wasn't just the situation that irked Eliza, it was the very presence of someone who didn't fit her stereotypical image of a first-class passenger. She felt uncomfortable, and that discomfort was translating into judgment. By now, the passengers around them were fully aware of what was happening. Leila could feel their eyes on her, but she chose to ignore them. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she was beginning to feel the sting of being judged unfairly. She had worked hard to earn this seat, and her ticket, just as valid as anyone else's, should have been enough. Eliza stood still for a moment, her gaze still lingering on Leila, as though she were expecting some sort of apology or acknowledgement of a mistake that Leila hadn't made. But when none came, Eliza stiffened and took another step back, as if readying herself for the next move. "I'll have to check with the captain," Eliza finally said, her voice sharper now. "There may be a glitch in the system." Leila's patience was beginning to wear thin, but she refused to let the flight attendant see it. She knew this wasn't just about a seat. This was about something deeper, something more insidious. "I've told you," Leila said firmly, "my ticket is valid. If you have an issue, I suggest you speak to the captain yourself. But I'm not moving." The confrontation had escalated, and the silence in the cabin was palpable. The passengers were now watching with bated breath, some of them nervously shifting in their seats. Tension hung in the air as Eliza's gaze flickered over to the passengers, feeling the growing pressure of the situation. Without another word, Eliza walked toward the cockpit, her heels clicking against the cabin floor. The moment was far from over, but Leila sat there, resolute, knowing that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The battle for fairness and respect in a world that often judged people based on their appearance. The cabin door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Greg Hartman, a middle-aged man in his late 40s, stepped into the first-class cabin. His expression was stern, his gaze immediately sweeping over the scene unfolding before him. With graying hair at the temples and a posture that screamed authority, Greg had the kind of commanding presence that instantly quieted any situation. But when his eyes fell on Leila, his face betrayed no trace of curiosity or interest in hearing her side of the story. Eliza, the flight attendant, was quick to seize the opportunity. She moved toward Greg with a sense of urgency, her voice low but laced with a tinge of accusation. "Captain, we have an issue," she said, not bothering to mask the underlying judgment in her tone. She gestured toward Leila, her words dripping with disdain. "This passenger is causing a disturbance. She refuses to move from her first-class seat, even though I'm sure she's in the wrong cabin. I've checked her ticket, but she insists that it's valid." Greg barely looked at Leila before nodding at Eliza, his decision already made. "I see," he muttered, his voice flat and dismissive. The moment his gaze settled on Leila, he didn't take the time to assess her calm demeanor, nor did he consider the possibility that something might be wrong with Eliza's approach. Instead, he immediately sided with the flight attendant, assuming that Leila's presence in first class was somehow out of place. "You're disturbing the passengers," Captain Greg said, his voice authoritative and curt. "I need you to leave the plane immediately. This is a first-class cabin, and you're causing unnecessary disruption." His words were cold, as if his mind was made up before he even fully understood the situation. Leila's calm insistence that she was seated in the correct place was disregarded completely. There was no interest in hearing her side, no acknowledgement of her rights, only the assumption that she didn't belong. The cabin fell into an eerie silence, all eyes now on Leila, who was momentarily taken aback by the pilot's sudden and hostile demand. She had dealt with prejudice in various forms throughout her life, but this was different. This was a clear act of bias, a decision made solely based on her appearance and how she was perceived. But it wasn't just the words that shocked her. It was the sense of power that Greg seemed to wield without question. Then, just as she was about to speak up again, trying to explain her ticket, something entirely unexpected happened. Without warning, Captain Greg raised his hand and struck Leila across the face. The sound of the slap was like a thunderclap, cutting through the tension that had settled over the cabin. The passengers gasped in shock, frozen in disbelief as they witnessed this unprovoked act of violence. Leila's face burned not just from the sting of the slap, but from the public humiliation that came with it. Her hand instinctively flew to her cheek as the redness from the blow began to spread. The cabin remained still, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. The passengers were too stunned to move, too shocked to speak out. There was no outcry, no attempt to intervene. It was as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for someone to take control of the situation. The humiliation Leila felt was like a wave crashing over her. But it wasn't just the slap that hurt. It was the blatant disrespect, the way she was treated as if she didn't belong, despite having a legitimate ticket, despite being a paying customer. The raw, ugly truth of the discrimination was on full display in that moment. Yet, despite the overwhelming urge to lash out, Leila remained composed. This was not just about the slap, not about her personal humiliation. This was a larger issue, a systemic problem that needed to be confronted. Leila had spent years working to rise above the biases that society often placed on her. And while this moment was a painful reminder of the prejudice she faced, she refused to let it control her. With a deep, steadying breath, Leila stood up slowly from her seat. She didn't shout, didn't react with anger or aggression. Instead, she walked with quiet dignity toward the exit, her steps measured and deliberate. She wasn't going to give Greg or Eliza the satisfaction of seeing her break down or retaliate. She knew that this battle wasn't going to be won with a few angry words or a scene. As she walked past the shocked passengers, their eyes following her every move, Leila didn't look back. She held her head high, refusing to let the weight of this moment define her. This wasn't about her. This was about something much bigger. It was about the culture of discrimination that still existed in places where it shouldn't. And while she might have been humiliated in that moment, she knew she had a power that Greg and Eliza would soon come to realize. The power to make change. As Leila exited the plane, she took one last look around the cabin. Her gaze was steady, her heart calm, knowing that this wasn't the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. Leila stood there for a moment, her hand still resting on the reddening mark on her cheek, the sting of the slap still fresh. But as the immediate pain began to subside, something deeper took its place, a resolve, firm and unshakable. She wasn't afraid, not in the least. Her heart was calm, her mind clearer than ever. Leila knew that reacting with anger, as tempting as it was, would only play into their hands. They wanted her to be emotional, to lash out, to give them a reason to justify their actions. But she wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. She understood that her true power lay in her ability to remain composed, to take control of the situation in a way they couldn't anticipate. With a quiet but steadying breath, Leila straightened her back and began walking toward the exit. Each step was deliberate, as if to remind herself that this moment, as painful as it was, didn't define her. This wasn't about the slap. It was about something far bigger. It was about the systemic discrimination that still lurked in corners of society, hidden behind facades of professionalism, where people were judged based on how they looked rather than who they were. As Leila walked down the aisle, she could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her, some of them filled with shock, some with silent judgment. But she didn't look at them. She didn't need their validation. She knew her worth, and she didn't need anyone else to tell her she deserved respect. Leila's mind was already working, already strategizing her next move. This wouldn't be a simple matter of seeking retribution for herself. No, this was about making sure that what happened to her never happened to anyone else. She had the resources, the influence, and the platform to make a real difference, and she wasn't about to waste that opportunity. She was going to hold the airline accountable, not just for this isolated incident, but for the broader cultural issue that allowed this kind of discrimination to persist. She had been a victim today, but she would not allow that victimhood to define her narrative. Instead, she would turn it into a tool for change, a catalyst for a movement within the airline industry that would force people to reckon with their biases. Leila wasn't interested in public revenge or making a scene. She knew that drama would only serve to distract from the real issue. No, she was going to be strategic. She would use her position, her legal team, and her network of allies to expose the deeper problem within the airline. She would ensure that this wasn't just a one-time occurrence that faded into the background. Instead of turning her pain into an emotional outburst, Leila would turn it into something powerful, a movement that could push for systemic reform, not just in this airline, but across the entire industry. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. She was going to create lasting change, and this moment, this painful, humiliating moment, would be the spark that ignited it all. As Leila stepped off the plane, her thoughts immediately shifted into action mode. The sting from the slap still pulsed on her cheek, but the fire within her grew brighter. She knew that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper, more systemic issue that she had seen time and time again, both in her personal life and in the corporate world. This wasn't about a personal vendetta. This was about something far larger, fighting against the invisible forces that perpetuated discrimination and inequality. Leila wasn't going to let this moment pass without taking definitive steps toward real change. Once she was safely away from the chaos of the plane, Leila took a moment to breathe. She had dealt with adversity all her life, but today, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. With her vast network of legal and business contacts, she had the power to make this issue known, and she was going to use that power, not to seek immediate revenge, but to create an opportunity for long-term change. She immediately began planning her next steps, pulling her legal team, as well as her trusted senior managers, into action. Her first order of business was clear: initiate a formal internal investigation into the behavior of Eliza and Captain Greg. Leila had no interest in a quick, superficial resolution. She wasn't interested in having them simply disciplined or dismissed, though she was sure that would come eventually. What mattered to her was uncovering the broader culture of discrimination within the airline, the kind of silent prejudice that ran deeper than any one incident. Leila knew that if she only focused on punishing those two individuals, the change she wanted to see would never come. This was a cultural issue, one that could not be fixed by a simple slap on the wrist. Instead, she demanded that the investigation look beyond the immediate wrongdoing. She needed her team to identify where the bias came from, how it had festered, and where it was being overlooked or even encouraged. She wanted to know how this kind of treatment could have taken place in the first place, and how many other passengers had been subjected to similar experiences. Her instructions to the investigation team were precise: do not simply seek to punish. Leila didn't want a story where the culprits were isolated and removed. She wanted a complete overhaul of the airline's internal culture. The real problem wasn't just one person's mistake. It was the fact that someone like Eliza, who had been entrusted with the responsibility of representing the airline's values, could make such assumptions based on appearance, and that Captain Greg could act on those assumptions without questioning his own biases. This wasn't an issue that could be fixed with a one-time reprimand. Leila made it clear that this investigation was about accountability at every level. She insisted that the team dive into the broader scope, looking into the hiring processes, employee training, and any previous complaints that might have been ignored or dismissed. She wanted to know if this behavior had been happening for years, under the surface, and if so, how deep it ran. Leila wasn't going to let this issue slip away quietly. She wanted transparency in the process, and she wanted a full understanding of how the airline had allowed discrimination to persist. At the same time, Leila began crafting a long-term plan for cultural transformation within the airline. She wasn't just going to expose the problem. She was going to offer a solution. She decided to take a more comprehensive approach that involved the airline's leadership. Leila would not stop until she ensured that not only Eliza and Captain Greg were held accountable, but also that the entire staff, from the ground crew to the pilots, underwent rigorous training on cultural sensitivity, diversity, and respect. She insisted that training be mandatory for all employees, and that it be ongoing, rather than a one-time event. Leila knew that creating lasting change meant reshaping the way the airline viewed and treated its passengers. It wasn't enough to simply respond to individual complaints. There needed to be a cultural shift that started at the top. As the investigation continued, she began thinking about how she could use her position to demand changes from within the airline, pushing for policies and practices that would foster respect and inclusivity, making sure that this kind of discrimination was not only condemned but actively prevented moving forward. In the weeks that followed, Leila's legal team quietly gathered information, interviewing passengers who had witnessed the incident, gathering data on similar complaints, and reviewing the airline's internal procedures. Leila was determined to make sure that by the time this was over, it wouldn't just be about punishing a few bad actors. It would be about transforming the entire airline into a model of respect and professionalism, where no one, regardless of appearance, race, or background, would ever again feel the sting of discrimination. She wasn't looking for quick fixes. Leila was thinking about a legacy of change, one that would outlast the immediate aftermath of this incident and have a ripple effect throughout the airline industry. As the internal investigation into the incident unfolded, the findings were far more troubling than Leila had anticipated. Initially, it had seemed like a singular, isolated event, an unfortunate, prejudiced interaction between a flight attendant and a captain. But as the investigation team dug deeper, they uncovered something much darker. Eliza and Captain Greg's behavior was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger, pervasive pattern of discriminatory attitudes within the airline. The team reviewed dozens of employee evaluations, customer complaints, and even past incidents of questionable behavior that had been quietly brushed aside. What they found was shocking. Numerous reports had been filed over the years by passengers who felt they had been treated unfairly based on their appearance, race, or background. In many cases, these complaints had been dismissed, with little to no investigation or follow-up. The airline had cultivated a culture where bias and prejudice were subtly reinforced, often ignored in favor of maintaining the company's pristine image. Leila had been right. This wasn't just about Eliza or Captain Greg. It was about a deeper, systemic issue that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. The investigation revealed that both employees had acted within an environment that not only tolerated, but at times even turned a blind eye to discriminatory conduct. The company's failure to properly address previous complaints, coupled with an internal culture that valued conformity over diversity, had allowed this toxic attitude to thrive. The findings were hard for the airline's leadership to ignore. Leila's team ensured that the findings were presented in stark terms. The airline's reputation, its credibility, and most importantly, the trust of its customers, had been compromised. Leila had made it clear from the beginning that she wasn't seeking to punish individuals for isolated mistakes. She wanted accountability for the whole system, and that meant taking a hard look at the company's failure to provide proper training, support, and oversight. As the investigation grew more public, with internal and external stakeholders taking notice, the company was forced to confront the truth about its culture. For Eliza and Captain Greg, the mounting pressure was undeniable. Both had assumed their actions would be swept under the rug, as had been the case with previous incidents. But now, their behavior was under scrutiny, and they could no longer ignore the weight of the consequences. They were no longer just isolated individuals making a poor judgment call. They were part of a much bigger issue, one that could ruin not just their careers but the integrity of the entire airline. Eliza, who had initially brushed off her actions as a misunderstanding, was now facing the harsh reality of her behavior. During her interviews with the investigators, she had been defensive, insisting that she had done nothing wrong, but the mounting evidence forced her to reckon with the reality of the situation. She had never seen her actions as part of a larger issue. She had simply been doing her job in her mind. But now, as she saw the broader patterns, she began to realize how deeply ingrained her own biases were. The more she reflected on her treatment of Leila, the more it became clear to her how wrong she had been. She had treated Leila differently based on nothing more than her appearance, assuming that a woman dressed simply didn't belong in first class. That assumption, she realized, was a reflection of her own prejudices she hadn't even been aware of until now. Captain Greg, on the other hand, felt the pressure in a different way. As a seasoned pilot, he had always prided himself on his authority and experience. His initial reaction had been to maintain control over the situation, to assert his power and make a quick decision. But now, he saw that his decision to slap Leila wasn't about maintaining order. It was a reaction to something deeper, something that had been shaped by years of implicit bias. His authority had given him the confidence to act without question, but now he began to see that his actions had violated the very principles of fairness and respect he had sworn to uphold as a leader in the airline industry. As the days passed and the investigation progressed, both Eliza and Greg were forced to confront the impact of their actions. They began to understand that their behavior had consequences far beyond this one flight. They had participated in a system that allowed discrimination to persist unchecked, and now they had to reckon with the damage they had caused, not just to Leila, but to the countless others who had experienced similar treatment over the years. The pressure continued to build, and the weight of the investigation loomed larger. Eliza and Greg, once so confident in their positions, were now questioning their own actions. They had failed to see the full extent of their biases, but now, with the investigation exposing the depth of the issue, they had no choice but to reflect on their behavior. As the investigation into the discriminatory actions of Eliza and Captain Greg unfolded, the ripple effect began to reach all corners of the airline. Employees, who had previously been unaware of the depth of the issue, were now faced with the undeniable truth that a culture of bias and prejudice had been allowed to fester unchecked. It became clear that the behavior displayed on that fateful flight was not an isolated incident but a reflection of a larger problem that permeated the company. As the findings of the investigation were shared across the organization, a shift in mindset began to take hold. Staff members started to realize that their treatment of passengers wasn't just about following rules. It was about respect and humanity. They understood that everyone, regardless of their appearance, background, or socioeconomic status, deserved to be treated with dignity. The realization was powerful. Many employees had never consciously considered the impact their behavior could have on passengers, but now they could no longer ignore the way their actions affected others. In response to the investigation, the airline's leadership, under Leila's guidance, quickly took action to address the culture shift needed within the company. Mandatory diversity and cultural sensitivity training was implemented for all staff members, from flight attendants to pilots, and even ground crew. The goal was clear: to educate everyone about unconscious biases, cultural differences, and the importance of inclusive practices. These training sessions weren't one-off workshops, but part of an ongoing process of self-reflection and growth. Leila was determined that this wouldn't be a temporary change, but a fundamental transformation that would shape the future of the airline. As the training began, the atmosphere within the airline slowly started to change. Employees who had previously dismissed the significance of their behavior now began to see the impact of their actions. The emphasis on empathy, respect, and understanding resonated deeply with many. A movement toward inclusivity took root, with more staff members actively engaging in discussions about how to foster a more welcoming and equitable environment for all passengers. The culture of the airline was beginning to shift as the company embraced a new, more inclusive identity. It wasn't just about correcting past mistakes. It was about building a future where respect and fairness were the foundation of every interaction. Leila's vision for the future of the airline went far beyond addressing the immediate issues that had come to light. She understood that the only way to ensure lasting change was to reshape the company from the inside out, starting with its core values and practices. Leila was determined to implement policies that would not just respond to the recent incident, but would also prevent similar issues from occurring in the future. One of her first steps was to revise the airline's hiring practices. Leila knew that true diversity couldn't be achieved unless it started at the very beginning, by ensuring that employees from all backgrounds and walks of life were considered for roles at every level of the company. She pushed for the recruitment process to be more inclusive, prioritizing skills, empathy, and cultural awareness, rather than just adhering to traditional qualifications. The goal was to create a workforce that reflected the diversity of the passengers they served. In addition to this, Leila implemented a more transparent customer complaint system. In the past, many complaints, especially those related to discrimination, had been ignored or dismissed without proper investigation. To rectify this, Leila insisted that every customer complaint be taken seriously and handled with transparency. She introduced a system that allowed passengers to easily voice their concerns, ensuring that each complaint was carefully investigated and resolved promptly. She wanted passengers to feel heard and validated, knowing that their experiences would lead to meaningful changes within the company. Leila also introduced leadership programs focused on building empathy and fairness. These programs were designed not just for senior management but for all employees in positions of authority. The aim was to train leaders who could inspire respect and inclusivity within their teams, creating a culture where understanding and fairness were prioritized. These programs taught employees to lead with empathy, emphasizing that a leader's true power comes from their ability to connect with others and make fair, informed decisions. With these initiatives in place, Leila began shifting the core values of the airline. She was determined to make respect, equality, and customer satisfaction the guiding principles of every aspect of the company. Whether it was in employee training or daily operations, every decision, interaction, and policy would reflect these values. Leila's leadership was about more than correcting past wrongs. It was about creating an environment where inclusivity and fairness were at the heart of everything the airline did, ensuring that future passengers would never experience the same kind of discrimination again. As part of the mandatory cultural sensitivity and diversity training, both Eliza and Captain Greg were required to engage in a deep process of personal reflection. Initially, they both struggled with the idea of confronting their biases, unable to fully grasp how their actions had been influenced by prejudices they had never fully acknowledged. However, as the training progressed, the reality of their behavior began to set in. The sessions included stories from colleagues and passengers, stories that were raw, powerful, and eye-opening. These real-life accounts of discrimination forced Eliza and Greg to see their actions from the perspective of those who had been hurt by them. One of the most impactful moments in the training was when a fellow employee shared their personal experience of being discriminated against on a flight. The passenger had been subjected to unfair treatment based solely on their appearance, much like how Leila had been treated, and the emotional toll it had taken was undeniable. Listening to these stories, Eliza and Greg began to feel the weight of their actions, how the assumptions they made about Leila had caused her unnecessary pain, and how their behavior contributed to a broader, harmful culture within the airline. For the first time, they saw the true impact of their biases, and it was a painful revelation. Both Eliza and Greg felt a deep sense of regret as they reflected on their past behavior. The training had opened their eyes to the fact that their actions were not just isolated mistakes but part of a larger problem, one that they had unknowingly perpetuated. With this new understanding, they began to take full responsibility for their treatment of Leila and others like her. In the weeks that followed, Eliza and Greg both reached out to Leila to apologize for their actions. They acknowledged that their previous behavior had been rooted in prejudice and that they had allowed their biases to cloud their judgment. They expressed genuine remorse for the way they had treated her, understanding that their actions had gone beyond a simple misunderstanding. Leila, though still processing the hurt she had experienced, recognized the sincerity in their apologies. Eliza and Greg's willingness to confront their mistakes and take responsibility was a crucial step in their personal growth, and it marked the beginning of their journey toward becoming more thoughtful, empathetic individuals. Leila's reforms were fully implemented across the airline, and the cultural shift she had envisioned began to take shape. From the top down, the company emphasized respect, equality, and professionalism in every aspect of its operations. Employee training sessions were revamped to prioritize cultural sensitivity, and the new hiring practices ensured a diverse and inclusive workforce. The complaint system, once opaque and dismissive, now offered transparency and fairness, allowing every passenger's voice to be heard. These changes created a more welcoming and respectful environment for both employees and customers. As the airline's transformation unfolded, the impact of Leila's actions rippled beyond her company and into the broader service industry. Her leadership inspired other businesses to examine their own practices and address systemic issues of discrimination within their cultures. Leila's efforts had sparked a movement, one that encouraged organizations everywhere to prioritize empathy and respect in their customer service and internal policies. Her commitment to fairness and justice was no longer confined to the walls of her airline. It became a benchmark for change across industries. Leila's legacy was one of profound transformation. She had turned personal pain into an opportunity to challenge the status quo and reshape an entire system. Her story sent a powerful message that even in the face of injustice, perseverance can lead to meaningful change. By confronting discrimination head-on, Leila had not only healed herself but also paved the way for a more just and equitable world for others. Her actions prove that even the most difficult battles, when fought with integrity and purpose, could lead to a lasting and transformative impact.